Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into some really complex systems?
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at casteism in India
Okay.
and racism in the US.
Hmm?
And it's really fascinating because while these systems seem like they're worlds apart,
Right.
they share some really striking similarities.
Hmm.
We're using episode 9 of the Voices in Equity podcast as our guide for today.
Awesome.
And it's really packed with insights from all these different experts. So
Yeah, it's a good one.
yeah, it is a really good one. One of the first things that really stood out to me was this idea that both casteism and racism rely on this belief of inherent superiority.
Absolutely.
Like some groups are just better than others based on who they are, not what they do.
Yeah, it's like this baked-in assumption that some people are just worth more.
Yeah.
And it's not about their actions or their character.
Right.
It's about something they can't control.
Right. And then that trickles down into every aspect of society,
Totally.
leading to all sorts of problems.
Oh, yeah. Discrimination, violence, you name it.
Yeah, it's like building a house on a shaky foundation.
That's a good analogy.
Everything becomes unstable.
Yeah.
Speaking of instability, the podcast highlights how historically disadvantaged groups like Dalits in India, that's the community traditionally considered the lowest in the caste hierarchy.
Right.
And Black Americans, they often bear the brunt of crises.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense when you think about it.
Yeah.
These systems, they create this vulnerability
Yeah.
that just gets magnified when things go wrong.
So like when a natural disaster hits.
Exactly, like a hurricane or a pandemic.
Yeah, or even just like an economic downturn.
Yeah, it all comes back to those deep-rooted inequalities.
Certain communities, they just face much harsher consequences.
It's like the system is rigged against them from the start.
Okay, let's unpack this idea of caste being more rigid than the racial hierarchy we see here in the U.S.
Okay.
Because this is something the podcast guest really emphasized.
Yeah.
What makes it so different?
Well, imagine this. You're born into a certain caste,
Okay.
and that label, it dictates your entire life. It
Mhm.
determines your job, who you can marry,
Wow.
even who you can eat with. There's very little room for social mobility.
And that's different from race, how?
Well, unlike race, where there's at least a possibility of passing or blurring the lines,
Okay.
your caste, it's fixed. It's fixed from birth.
It's like it's set in stone.
Exactly, and virtually impossible to escape.
Wow, that's a powerful way to put it.
It's like you're assigned a role in a play
Yeah.
that you never auditioned for,
Right.
and you're stuck with it,
Yeah.
no matter how talented you are.
It doesn't matter how good of an actor you are.
Nope.
You're stuck.
You can't change roles.
And to enforce these rigid boundaries,
Yeah.
the concept of purity,
Okay.
it becomes central. Like intercaste marriage, for example,
Mm-hmm.
often seen as a threat to this purity,
I see.
and therefore heavily discouraged or even forbidden.
So it's not just about prejudice
Yep.
or individual acts of discrimination.
It's bigger than that.
It's about maintaining a whole social order.
Absolutely. And this is where we see another parallel with racism.
Both systems rely on dehumanizing language
Yeah.
and stereotypes
Right.
to justify the unequal treatment of certain groups.
Yeah. It's like creating a narrative that makes it easier to ignore individual merit
Exactly.
and just write someone off based on their caste or their race.
It's about reducing people to a label
Right.
and then using that label to justify treating them differently.
The podcast also brought up some fascinating figures who challenged these systems, like Mahatma Gandhi.
Oh, yeah.
His stance on the caste system was surprisingly complex, wasn't it?
It really was. On one hand, he passionately advocated for the rights of Dalits. He even called them Harijans,
Which means,
children of God.
okay.
But on the other hand, he also upheld certain Hindu traditions that inadvertently reinforce the caste hierarchy.
So it's like he was trying to walk this tightrope.
Yeah, it's a very nuanced and sometimes controversial aspect of his legacy.
And then we have B.R. Ambedkar, a scholar and activist who came from the Dalit community himself.
Right.
He really pushed back against Gandhi's approach, didn't he?
He did. Ambedkar believed in complete liberation for Dalits
Okay.
and saw Gandhi's efforts as insufficient. It's fascinating because Ambedkar actually corresponded with W.E.B. Du Bois,
Wow.
the famous African-American sociologist and activist. They saw the parallels,
Between?
the struggles of Dalits in India and Black Americans in the U.S.
That's amazing.
Ambedkar even drew inspiration from the U.S. Constitution
Really?
when he was drafting India's.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
It's like these seemingly separate struggles
Yeah,
were actually part of a larger global fight for equality.
exactly. And the podcast also mentions Martin Luther King Jr.'s visit to India in 1959.
Right.
King was deeply inspired by Gandhi's philosophy, nonviolent resistance.
Yeah.
He saw its potential for social change
Uh-huh.
and adopted it as a central strategy in the U.S. civil rights movement.
Wow. So these ideas traveled across continents
It's amazing.
and influenced movements on opposite sides of the world.
It really shows you how interconnected these struggles for justice really are.
Okay, so we've got these two systems.
Yeah.
Casteism and racism operating in vastly different contexts.
Yeah.
But with some striking similarities.
Uh-huh.
Now, the podcast takes a really interesting turn by bringing up Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste,
Oh, yeah.
which argues that the U.S. has its own caste system based on race.
It's a provocative book for sure.
It is, and the Voices in Equity episode really digs into it.
It does.
The guests present different perspectives on her thesis,
Mm-hmm.
so it gives you, the listener, a lot to consider.
It definitely gets you thinking.
I think what Wilkerson does so well is she forces us to look beyond individual prejudice
Right.
and consider the deeper structures
It's a system.
that might be upholding inequality.
Yeah, it's not just about individual bad actors.
Right. It's like she's saying, even in societies that claim to be based on merit,
Uh-huh.
there could be this hidden caste system at play.
Working behind the scenes.
That's a crucial point.
Yeah.
It challenges us to question whether racism is just about individual biases
Right.
or if it's something more deeply ingrained.
Like a system woven into the very fabric of society.
Yeah. It's like that saying, we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them.
I like that.
Do you think Wilkerson's book
Yeah.
offers a new way of thinking about these issues?
I think she definitely offers a new lens
Yeah.
through which to view these issues. One of the things she highlights
Yeah.
is the arbitrary nature of these categories.
Mhm.
For example, in the U.S., the definition of whiteness.
Right.
It has shifted over time.
Mm.
Groups that were once excluded, like
Mhm.
Irish and Italian immigrants,
Right.
they were eventually incorporated into this dominant
The
category.
category itself changed.
It did. It really underscores how these classifications are socially constructed,
Yeah.
not based on any biological reality.
Right. So it's like the rules of the game can change.
Yeah.
But the game itself, this system of ranking and dividing
Right.
people,
Right.
it persists.
It's like this underlying structure.
Yeah. It makes you wonder if seemingly separate societies on opposite sides of the globe
Mm-hmm.
develop such similar systems of oppression.
Yeah.
What does this say about human nature?
It's a question that has puzzled scholars and philosophers for centuries.
bet.
Is this tendency to create hierarchies
Right.
and exploit others somehow ingrained in us?
Like, is it just part of who we are?
Or is it a product of our social and economic systems? It's a fascinating question.
It is.
And a complex one.
Yeah.
And I think understanding these systems, both casteism and racism,
Right,
can
right.
help us grapple with it.
The Voices in Equity podcast also emphasizes the importance of coalition building
Yeah,
among oppressed groups.
absolutely.
And this idea really resonated with me. Throughout history, we've seen the power of solidarity
Oh, yeah.
in challenging injustice.
There's strength in numbers.
Yeah. When groups unite and leverage their collective power,
Right.
they can achieve much more than they could alone.
They can move mountains.
Yeah. The civil rights movement in the U.S. is a prime example.
Absolutely.
Black activists worked alongside white allies,
Right.
labor unions, religious groups
All pushing for change.
to push for change. And within the movement itself,
Yeah.
there were coalitions formed between those advocating for voting rights, desegregation, and economic justice.
It was a multifaceted movement.
Yeah, it wasn't just one monolithic block.
Right.
It was a network of interconnected struggles,
Right.
all united by this common goal of equality.
The desire for a better future.
It makes you wonder, what are some other successful coalition-building efforts that we can learn from?
Well, in India, Dalit groups have formed alliances with Adivasas.
And who are they?
They're indigenous tribal people also facing marginalization.
I see.
And these alliances have been instrumental pushing for land rights and political representation.
So even though they have their own unique struggles,
Yeah.
they can recognize a common enemy
Yeah.
in the system itself.
The system that's oppressing them both.
A system that denies basic human rights and dignity to entire groups of people.
It's about recognizing that shared experience of oppression.
Right.
And that's the foundation for building trust and solidarity,
Okay.
which are essential for effective coalition building.
But I imagine it's not always easy.
Oh, it's definitely not. You're bringing together people
Well.
with different histories,
Uh-huh.
different perspectives, different priorities. There can be tensions
Of course.
and disagreements even within alliances.
But the key is to focus on that common ground.
Right.
That shared vision of a more just and equitable society.
It's about understanding that true liberation is interconnected. My freedom is bound up with your freedom.
We can't dismantle these systems piecemeal.
No.
We have to work together to create a world
Yeah.
where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Absolutely. So we've been talking a lot about these big systemic issues,
Right.
but how do we connect that to our everyday lives?
Yeah. How do we as individuals
Mm.
challenge these systems of oppression?
That's a great question. And it's one that the Voices in Equity podcast also grapples with.
Okay.
I think one of the most important things we can do is engage in deck self-reflection.
Okay.
We all have biases, conscious or unconscious,
Right.
shaped by our upbringing, our experiences, the messages we've absorbed from society.
Yeah, like we're all products of our environment in a way.
Exactly. The first step is to become aware of those biases,
Yep.
to really examine our own assumptions
Yeah.
and ask ourselves, where did this belief come from? Is it based on evidence or just a prejudice I've internalized?
It's like shining a light into those dark corners of our minds.
Yeah.
Where those unconscious biases might be lurking.
And once we've identified them,
Oh.
we can start to challenge them,
Yeah.
to question them, to dismantle them.
And this work is ongoing, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's not a one-time fix. It's a constant process
Yeah.
of learning, unlearning, and reevaluating our beliefs and behaviors.
It's a reminder that this isn't just some intellectual exercise.
No.
It's about confronting injustice in all its forms.
Yeah.
Both within ourselves and in the world around us.
Right.
And working to create a society
Uh-huh.
where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential,
Absolutely.
unhindered by these arbitrary social hierarchies.
It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play, dismantling these structures of oppression.
So whether it's speaking up when someone makes a prejudiced comment or educating ourselves about the history and ongoing impact of these systems,
Right.
or supporting organizations, working for social justice,
Every action matters.
every action, no matter how small,
Can contribute to creating a more just and equitable world.
it's like those ripples in a pond.
Yeah,
Even a small pebble can create waves that extend outwards.
exactly. So as we wrap up our deep dive into casteism and racism, I want to bring it back to you, the listener.
We've explored these seemingly separate systems and uncovered some striking parallels.
We've seen how they operate, the harm they inflict, and the challenges in dismantling them.
We've also seen the power of resistance, the importance of speaking out against injustice, and the potential for positive change through collective action. So as you go about your day, we want to leave you with this question.
If these systems of oppression arose independently in different parts of the world, what does that tell us about the human capacity for both creating and dismantling such structures?
It's a question that might not have easy answers, but it's a question worth pondering because as we grapple with the complexities of casteism and racism, we're ultimately grappling with the complexities of the human experience itself.
And in that struggle, in that shared journey towards understanding and dismantling these systems, lies the possibility of building a more just and equitable world for all. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, this was a really thought-provoking one. It really was.
We'll see you next time.